Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking your time out today to attend this event. My name is Amar Khaira, incoming president of the PPE Student Association. Before we begin the panel today, I'd like to invite Tade Hagbarian, vice president of the PPE Student Association and the brainchild behind today's event, to say a few words. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tade Hagbarian, and I'm the vice president of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics Student Association at the UBCO. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's panel event, The Future of Canadian Conservatism. First of all, let me extend a warm welcome to our students, faculty, and community members in the audience. Thank you for taking the time on a Friday night to engage with some big ideas. Huge thanks as well to the folks who made tonight possible. This event is entirely student organized, but we had help from amazing sponsors. On behalf of the PPE Student Association, I want to thank the Manning Foundation, the UBCO Student Union, the Macdonald Laurier Institute, and the Heterodox Academy campus community for their support. I'd also like to thank our PPE department and the student team organizing, who worked tirelessly behind the scenes. From booking the room to wrangling our speaker schedules, our team of student volunteers has been on it. Let me introduce Dr. Catherine Craig from UBCO's Political Science Department. She'll be moderating tonight's conversation. We're thrilled she's here to guide the discussion with a firm yet friendly touch. Thank you, Dr. Craig. And now finally, the stars of the show, our panelists. We have four incredible speakers with us, each bringing a unique perspective. Let me introduce them one by one. Stockwell Day, former leader of the Canadian Alliance. He's the former leader of the Canadian Alliance and the senior cabinet minister who's held more government roles than I have midterms. Mr. Day has been at the heart of Canadian conservatism for decades, and we're honored to have him here. Dr. Ian Brodie. A leading figure in Canadian political science, Dr. Brodie brings both academic expertise and hands-on political experience. He served as the Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, meaning he had a front row seat to conservative policymaking. Tristin Harper. Many know Mr. Harper for his sharp columns in the National Post and for social media stunts like creating Canada's largest Rice Krispie square. He teased this event by saying he'd appear with three men with receding hairlines. I won't name names. He also confessed he had a nightmare about tonight, so expect a healthy dose of comedic irreverence alongside his keen insight. Jonathan Kay. Mr. Kay is a renowned journalist and author known for tackling tough questions head-on. You may have read his work in places like The Walrus or followed his lively Twitter feed. He has a knack for cutting to the core of an issue, and he's not shy about sharing bold opinions. This event is proudly student-led and running on a student budget. So there were no 5-star honorariums or luxury perks here, even though our panelists definitely deserve it. We're immensely grateful that our panelists have traveled to Kelowna and donated their time to share their expertise. Their willingness to support open dialogue with the next generation of thinkers is truly appreciated. Before we hand things over to our panel, I want to highlight that this event is non-partisan. Our goal in the PPE Student Association is to foster open dialogue and critical thinking. Tonight's discussion isn't about advocating any one ideology or converting anyone to a particular viewpoint, and the opinions expressed are those of the speakers alone. In other words, the viewpoints you'll hear are not official positions of the UBC Okanagan or the PPE Student Association. We believe universities are the perfect place for open political dialogue. Everyone is welcome here regardless of their political standpoint. Our goal is to learn from one another in a spirit of respectful inquiry. Tonight is about exploring ideas that shape our political landscape. Let's keep the discussion thoughtful, respectful, and open to challenging our own assumptions. Now let's take a moment to outline how tonight will unfold. We'll begin with a moderated discussion led by Dr. Craig, who will pose a series of questions and guide our panelists through a conversation on key topics. After that, we'll open the floor to Q&A, which is your chance to jump in with questions. We'd love to hear from as many of you as possible, so please keep your questions concise, thoughtful, and respectful. Think of it as inviting our panelists to share more insight rather than delivering your own lengthy monologue. Our aim is respectful and an engaging discussion. Lastly, I want to note that it is not every day that we get to have a former cabinet minister, a former prime minister's chief of staff, and two prominent journalists all together in one room here in Kelowna. Take a moment to appreciate how cool that is for a student-led event. That's enough from me. That's more than enough for me. I'll hand the mic over to Dr. Catherine Craig to kick off the discussion.
Awesome, thank you, Tade. And I just want to reiterate, I guess, the last part of what Tade was saying. This is a student-run event, and our students have put an incredible amount of work in organizing this and bringing out our speakers and making sure that all of you can come out and enjoy it as well, which is a really incredible and impressive thing that they've been up to. So thank you so much to all of you for doing this work as well. So we're going to start off our conversation tonight to make sure, I suppose, that we all have some sense of what we are talking about here. We have 4 different speakers who are coming from a range of perspectives and experiences in politics and in public discourse. And so we're going to begin with a question, with providing our panelists a few moments to explain their understanding of the fundamental principles of conservatism and how they understand those principles to be uniquely manifested in Canada, if at all. So we'll begin with that question, and maybe we'll work our way down the row with our panelists. We can begin with you, Mr. We can begin. You can rock, paper, scissors if you would like. Work our way down.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to come, and congratulations to the association for putting on an ambitious event that's also, I think, open to the discussion. I think UBCO has got a good institutional commitment to something that used to be common amongst Canadian universities, and maybe it's not as common as it once was and should be again in the future, so I appreciate that everybody's put this together tonight. When I think of conservative, students, colleagues, journalists sometimes ask what I mean by that. I think the conservative idea is to be inherently skeptical and at least at first opposed to wide-ranging programs of top-down social reform, particularly ones that are led by government or that government's trying to do in conjunction with business. I think the ones we've been most worried about over the course of the past 15 years are really kind of top-down environmentalism based on kind of command and control economics. The carbon tax is only the least offensive of a whole slew of programs in that area. We just have to be careful about it. It's not just an environmental program, but a social program as well. And then there's been a whole demolition of underlying ideas about Western Enlightenment, attacks on nation-state ideas, on the attacks on the idea of Canada, settler, colonial ideas, and so forth. I think those have been the principal problems of the past couple of years. So, unlike other conservatives, I don't start with taxes, I don't start with an economic policy idea. I start with a more comprehensive idea that there's a constant pressure for people who are in government or who want to use the powers of government in cooperation with big business to force big social reforms on society. I think the natural inclination to want to stop that, slow that down, think about it again, that's the core of conservative.
Can I ask a follow-up just before we move on? So you mentioned the idea of Canada. What did you mean by that?
Look, I don't think it's unique to Canada that in all of the New World societies, there's an attack from starting inside the university on the idea of the legitimacy of nation states in settled parts of the world, with the idea that somehow it's okay for nation states to exist in Europe, but everywhere else that Europeans went to set up nation states, that those are somehow illegitimate nation states. That's the idea of it. You know, it has a particular implication for Canada, but it has similar implications for the United States, for Australia, for all sorts of countries around the world, and that's what it's driving.
Okay, Mr. Brodie.
Well, Ian said it all, so Ian, thanks so much. And again, just echoing appreciation for so many people being here on Friday night. If I think back to academic year 69-70, University of Victoria, Friday night, I would not be found in a group of illustrious and concerned people like this. So super here, and a pretty useful looking crowd. Of course, at my part and time in the age spectrum, that's easy to say, but good to see a good selection of students here. I'm always curious, as a recovering politician, any of our friends from the media here? Oh, wow, great, okay.
What's those two?
I was, I said friends, yeah, so, okay, which is, I just always like to know that. Ian has defined, set off a good definition here in this healthy skepticism and sincere questions related to change, and especially if it's going to be radical change. And incrementalism, change should be done in an incremental way. Conservatism, of course, flowing from the values and mindset discussed by thinkers throughout the 1700s, 1800s, and defining the role of the individual, the importance of the individual. It used to be, as we know, classic liberalism, and that term has moved away. So let me just toss a couple of things out. Ian has set the table here. First of all, whatever definition we come up with of a conservative, it's a moving target over time. It changes. In 1917, let's look at fiscal policy. 1917 was the first year we had an income tax in Canada. It was unheard of back then. What, you would tax people for what they worked so hard to gain? It was unheard of. But there was a war going on, so let's go for it. And at one point in the discussions of the debate in the House of Commons, somebody stood up and said, mark my words, they were opposed to this. Mark my words, if we agree to a 1% income tax today, there will be one day a tax of 3% on our income. And he was almost laughed out of the House of Commons. So the target's moving now. As a conservative, we can say, a tax, we're going to try and lower it to maybe 30%. And everybody goes, well, that's radical. So this is a moving target. Look at social outlook on things in a bit of a maybe humorous, maybe not so humorous way. Let's look at dress or dress code. In 1900, as people were starting to discover the fun of beaches and swimming, of course, women, their suits were, down to the ankles and long sleeved, and men's wore the vests and also long pants. And over time, then that was a conservative way to bathe. Over time, that changes, and now it's radically different what's accepted in terms of what's conservative, what's acceptable. So it's a moving target. This constantly changes. If I can put out what conservatism isn't, and then that can kind of bounce off of what Ian said and what my colleagues and the doctor will say. You've heard the term cultural Marxism. And of course we know we're talking about Marx, and I have to say this before some university crowds, I'm not talking about Groucho's brother here. We're talking about Karl Marx, who's written about this issue and formulated a lot of thought around communism. So figure out the basic precepts of what communism should be as defined by Marx. Marx is gone, but those leading indicative thoughts have permeated all the way through this century. So number one, not only is there no God, there cannot be a God. There cannot be. In public discourse, in the terms of our laws, etc., that was stipulated very clearly and practiced by the Soviet Union and by most communist operations around the world. And so that's number one. And then number two, if there is no God in which people are going to have some sense of responsibility to, then family is really a construct that has to be deconstructed. Family as defined up until that point in time, according to Marx, was very negative, paternalistic, and has to be radically dismantled. And we've seen that through policy of, we can pick all kinds of policies on that. The individual, if that individual, he or she is not going to be, have original initial formulations within a family context, the need to have a home is really not that, pervasive. And so if you don't need a home, you really don't need personal property or private property. And so that becomes anathema to the thinking of government. And as you're moving to take that away, well, if you can't have personal property, then ownership of the personal gain that you have through your work and effort, that should really be up to the state also. And to achieve that, there's going to have to be a fairly significant overthrow of the existing system. So change has to be radical and revolutionary rather than incremental. And then those who are going to speak, you know, not just Marx, but everybody who's followed him in true ideological communism, has said, well, anybody who speaks against these principles that are going to bring peace and wonderment to the earth, anyone who speaks against that is actually a threat to the good of humankind and has to be eliminated. And of course, the Soviet Union, Marx and others, Stalin, they literally took that into being. Now, with cultural Marxism, and these same thoughts being expressed in a different way, you have to, for the good of society, you have to eliminate dissenting voices. And the way you do that is cancel people. And just as Stalin and co. would shoot them publicly in a public square, you only have to shoot a couple, and everybody else follows in line. You only have to cancel a couple of people very publicly, and everybody falls in line. I know what that's like personally, and here's my crybaby routine, to the tune of millions of dollars. When you are canceled publicly and accused of something that is not the case, that's actually culturally Marxist thinking. Dissenting voices have to be very publicly crushed and snuffed out. And then really the people, you know, some of them might have some interesting thoughts, but there's a few really smart people among us, and there should be this tight little core of elitist thinkers who are very much smarter, scientifically inclined than the rest of you people, and so that's who's going to rule. And we've seen, of course, the whole concept of elitist thinking, a few smart people, and everybody else should just be following along. So I toss that out as, first of all, the target moves in terms of conservatism and what we look like, and all the things that I just defined in terms of Marxism have pretty well, not 100%, overtaken thought at universities, etc. And so even when media, people are down on the media, maybe as they should be, and I'm being careful here, but mainstream, for somebody who has been bathed in this type of thinking for years, when they hear a conservative thought, they will react as that's almost like an evil thought. And so you can't blame them for reactionary thought to expressions of conservative views. So I toss those ideas out for discussion, refutation, or otherwise.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Certainly not conserving time. But anyway.
It's a moving target.
I think it all goes back. I would define it as generally just going back to Chesterton's fence. This is G.K. Chesterton, who just basically said if you approach a fence, you could potentially tear down the fence, but before you do that, you have to figure out why the fence is there. So when I see people who have become conservatives, you know, as they enter their 30s or for whatever reason, it's usually because they've had their own personal encounter with a version of Chesterton's fence. So, plenty of young people, I'm 38 years old, grew up thinking, oh, you know, it was super cool to hate on religion. Who can have the best imaginary friend? And then someone like me, as you get older, you realize you see enough friends fall for multi-level marketing scams, and they get into crystal therapy, and at a certain point you think, this person really would have been better off with Jesus. There's a truck in my neighborhood that I go past, and it always says, it's just covered in red paint, you know, Jesus is Lord and stuff, and every time I go past it, I think, that guy's not getting into trouble. I mean, I'm glad he's into that rather than any number of other things. I think that's also true of, you know, drugs are bad. Plenty of legalized everything people have had second thoughts in recent years, saying, well, actually, maybe Maybe it wasn't so dumb that we did have these as controlled substances in earlier generations. Maybe do something that I didn't. My own personal one is streetcars. Streetcars used to be in every city across Canada. I always thought it was really dumb, and I was so much smarter than people from the past where I would have kept the streetcars and we would have whimsical ways to get around the city until I lived in Toronto. I realized streetcars are really dumb. And yeah, they don't work in any modern traffic, and it's good to rip them out. So yeah, I would say conservatism is just sort of a humility to, you know, maybe these institutions exist for a reason, and even if they don't make sense to me, I should sort of understand that. In terms of conservatism specific to Canada, I've heard the argument that leftism all looks the same everywhere. It's all just raised fists and, you know, red flags and solidarity chants. But conservatism is always unique to each country. So a long time ago, I wrote a story that nobody read. This is in 2016, during the rise of Donald Trump. And I tried to imagine what Donald Trump would look like in each country, because I said, your dyspeptic populist, he's a very American figure, and your dyspeptic populist is going to look different. So I looked, what would the Irish Trump look like? And what would the Argentinian Trump look like? And first of all, I discovered a lot of countries have already had their Trump. I would call up a political scientist, and they'd say, well, this is Australia. It's, who's that fat guy who said he was going to build the Titanic? That's their Trump. And the one I settled on for Canada was, it would be just your standard lock up the criminals, cut taxes, you know, deport the criminals. But I thought the main difference for Canada is that it could be a gay Chinese grandmother, which you probably couldn't say about a lot of countries around the world. So I think I would define Canadian conservatism by some things that it's not compared to other countries. It's not really wrapped up with any kind of ethno group, which is, you're really not going to find that in Europe. Usually there's going to be some idea that there are people who cannot be part of the Conservative Party. Maybe that was once the case, all the way back in the 1930s, when Conservative Parties were just guys in double-breasted suits, all smelling like Old Spice, but I just don't see it present in the modern version of Canadian conservatism. It's also very pro-immigration. This is very rare among world conservative parties, that you would have a conservative movement that is going to be skeptical of the excesses. Don't bring in 1.2 million temporary migrants in the course of a single year, but generally is agreed that you can take people from around the world at high levels, and as long as they're integrated, you can turn people from all over the world into Canadians. That is very unique to a conservative movement. I think it's very unique to Canada. Also, conservatives aren't really into military stuff here, like they are almost everywhere else in the world. That's the only thing that sort of stood out. That seems to be shared equally between them, the Liberals, etc. But yeah, there isn't this unique fundamental connection between army stuff and conservatives, like there would be between Republicans and the U.S. military.
Streetcars in?
Yeah, they're really standard.
Okay. This is how you spend your Friday night. First of all, thank you to the organizers. Although someone on the diversity committee fell asleep over here. But I'm happy. Hey, I'm from the East Coast, so I think I'm
a quarter Austrian.
Okay. Well, now turn to questions. No. Look, I hate to talk about Edmund Burke, but whenever you're talking about, and I promise I'll be brief, whenever you talk about conservatism, you have to go back to the French Revolution and Edmund Burke. And the only reason I'm talking about this is because the sort of person who comes to this event on a Friday night probably knows who Edmund Burke is, or should know who Edmund Burke is, because you're going to spend a lot of your life alone. And so you're going to have a lot of time to read. No, but also if you're a university student, university is the time to read, tracts of 18th century political literature. But the short description is, great thinker, observed the horrible things that happened during the French Revolution in the name of progress, and said there has to be some political force, some ideological force that helps us resist the impetuousness of political fads, which often do lead to progress, but often are destructive. And you saw this in the 18th century, dramatically the French Revolution, and yes, people hated the king, but guess what? Robespierre was worse. You need some coherent ideological force that stands in the way of somebody who has a seductive idea, and especially a totalizing idea. The French revolutionaries had a totalizing idea about how to redo society. Stockwell, they talked about communism. These totalizing creeds can take over society very quickly, and unless there are people in society who are able to argue for some form of the traditional social contract, then those fads can take over society very quickly and be destructive. Now, I think it's important to say that conservatism isn't an ideology that should demand that society be locked in a particular state forever and ever and ever. Technology changes, history moves on. Even the most doctrinaire conservative has to make allowances for the fact that things change. But at the very least, conservatism should be an idiom, a way of describing how change can be brought about in society in a way that keeps the best from the past. And one of my favorite examples here, which may seem obscure, if you're a student, you've grown up just assuming gay marriage is the law of the land, as it has been for 2 decades. Someone my age will know that there was a big political discussion about gay marriage when it became law, and there were lots of people who objected to it. What changed my mind on gay marriage was there's a great writer named Jonathan Rauch, happens to be an American writer. I don't know if people know of him. He's at the Brookings Institute now. Brilliant writer, writes for Atlantic magazine sometimes, and he wrote a book called The Conservative Case for Gay Marriage. That happened to be the book that convinced me that gay marriage was a good thing. And what I love about the book is the book didn't start with a bunch of accusations and saying, get with it, you homophobe, it's 2005 or whatever it was. He talked respectfully about the traditional functions of marriage, and the traditional functions of the nuclear family, and the traditional functions of state policy encouraging people to create bonds and households and unions and forms of dependency that encourage trust in society and encourage people to live fulfilled lives. And Jonathan Rauch, who happens to be gay, wrote about how there was value in including gay people in that type of social contract. And guess what? He was right. And at the time, Barack Obama opposed gay marriage. And this is, not exactly ancient history. The most liberal, at the time, ever more, the most socially progressive liberal president the United States has ever had opposed gay marriage. So this isn't exactly ancient history. And it took a conservative, in my case, using the idiom of conservatism, the idiom of saying, what are the things we respect? What are the things that are timeless? What are the values that are the bedrock of our society? Let's extend those values to a new constituency. So in that case, I don't think anybody would say, well, what's a conservative value? Gay marriage, that's a conservative value. But it's the idiom of conservatism that can help bridge the gap between new social demands and old institutions. And that to me is when conservatism is at its best. I'll give another example. Indigenous rights. I remember when I was doing reporting on Indigenous reserves for the National Post, I met with band leaders, and they were talking about some of the problems they were having on the reserves. These are well documented and well known, and substance abuse and single parent families like this. And he was saying, he said it in passing, but I thought it was interesting insight. He said the problem is, this is like 15 years ago, he says the problem is a lot of these people went to residential schools, and as a result, they didn't have a strong experience of being parented, because a lot of their time was spent at residential schools. And so when it was their time to be a parent, they didn't have the skills they needed to be a parent. And then, as a result, their family structure suffered. And as he talked about it, he was speaking a conservative language. He was speaking about the nuclear family. He was speaking about being a good parent, being a responsible adult, creating strong societies, in this case within Indigenous communities, but societies are strong and weak for all the same reasons, regardless of their skin color. And it really resonated with me, because he was using isn't how he would have put it. He was using the idiom of conservatism, of family values, to describe a complaint about Canadian society and our historical treatment of Indigenous people that most of us would associate with, progressive politics, and in its extreme form with the delegitimization of Canada itself. So I think, again, I like talking to students because students are just starting out their intellectual lives. So unlike people who, work at people who, maybe they don't have time to go home and read 400 pages of Edmund Burke, university students can, maybe you're in second year or something, you can select what courses you're going to take and what you're going to read. And if you choose to explore the canon of conservative thinkers, try to think about how their ideas can not only translate to the actual values, because in many cases they were writing at a time when everyone was anti-Semitic and homophobic and sexist, and as a result they get discredited on that basis, but that's not what's important. What's important is the idiom they create that can be applied in a way to bridge gaps between the demands that progressives make of our society and the institutions and values and loyalties that should be important to us. And we see what happens when progressives skip that step. And they go straight to the step of saying, we demand this, that, and the other, and if you don't like it, you're a bigot. And it turns everyone off, and we use the term divisive a lot, that's divisive. Instead of saying, let's start with the values that have gotten us here, and let's try and extrapolate those values in a thoughtful way, dare I say in a conservative way, to try and accommodate the demands of constituencies that maybe didn't exist 10 or 20 years ago. That to me is when conservatism is at its best. And I have no views on streetcars. I live in Toronto. I think they're fine. I think it's weird that you brought it up. But maybe in the Q&A we can talk more about municipal transportation.
Thank you. I wanted to jump off of how you ended there with this idea of conservative values. So this sort of sense of deference to the past in some way that's come out with what all of you have said, I'm very sympathetic to as someone who teaches the history of political thought, and not just 18th century political thought, but like 500 BC political thought. So that makes some sense to me. We've heard the language of, conservatism is a moving target. We should have skepticism of large-scale government action. We should have this deference to the past. And I guess I'm just wondering, similar to what Mr. Kay was just saying, is conservatism just sort of, if you were going to articulate what those conservative values are beyond just being cautious about social change, how would you articulate that? Is there a guiding star that you look to when you're saying, oh, we should be skeptical about this, this is how we determine whether or not something should change or not change, or is it just a kind of means thing? Is it, well, we should be cautious, we should take our time? Is there something that guides that thinking that you would look to? I don't know if someone wants to jump in on that right away.
I would totally jump in.
Thank you.
But I just spoke.
But it was actually, this reminded me of something when Mr. Kay was bringing up, talking band leaders, and this is around the time of Teresa Spence going under. I remember when you were writing that series. So he's in the Atwapiskat area. I was interviewing an old Mountie who used to work in what is now Nunavut, so the high Arctic. And now, if you're a Mountie in the high Arctic, you have to be in a two-person detachment because these are some of the most high crime areas, on the entire continent. Crazy high levels of murder. The territories have always had the highest homicide for like the last 20 years or something. Crazy high levels of sexual assault, everything. And so I was asking him as a Mountie, what was it like as recently as the 1950s? And he said, nothing. I was basically a government agent. I took the census, and every once in a while, someone would come in and say they were having a heart attack, and I'd say it's probably heparin, and I'd give them like some Alka-Seltzer. And he said we didn't even have a uniform. We would show up and we would just get a local to knit us to make us a parka. And so you just had your RCMP cap. And he said the reason was the Inuit society had been around for 10,000 years. They knew what they were doing. They had systems in place to tamp down murder, to tamp down sexual assault, to work within an Arctic community. And that was just the 1950s. And then, so you've got relocation and all these sort of systems are smashed apart, thus yielding many of the social problems we see now. So, that's a great example of is there a bit higher sensitivity to keeping what works from the past? Instead of thinking that you immediately have a better idea, you avoid a lot of problems. So again, I wasn't a churchgoer growing up, but I always liked the idea of people just going to a room and having some 21-year-old kid telling them that they're not all that and they haven't figured everything out and they should, just have faith that everything's going to work out. So I like this humility that you don't have all the answers and you don't have to control everything. And sometimes, people who are not you may have a better idea.
Sure. I think at the core of a conservative movement should be empiricism and a sense of looking at human nature in an honest way. And this is something that goes back in a powerful way to Hobbes and the idea that left their own devices and without some kind of overarching state control, life is nasty, brutish, and short. And of course, Hobbes's solution, we're never going back to a true autocratic monarchy. But Hobbes very much, and I think Burke extended that tradition, in a tradition of empiricism, recognizing the flaws in human nature. And in Christianity, the idea is original sin. A more secularized version of that is recognizing that we all have within us an instinct toward greed and dishonesty, and that societies do break down unless there are strictures placed upon us. And of course, taken to an extreme, you get like communist dystopia and stuff like that. But to a certain extent, having some kind of state power that enforces norms and punishes crime is a conservative value because it's based on our empirical understanding of human nature. And sometimes if you look at the more exalted reveries about human nature that progressives will promote, they are kind of ridiculous because they're detached from empiricism. Men can become women, women can become men. This colored human being never lies. This colored human being is always evil. Like, humans are all fallible. They all do bad things, they all do good things, they all respond to incentives. They all require a social purpose. For me, bringing this back to Canada, one of the great tragedies of Indigenous policy in Canada has been this complete myth that people who happen to be Indigenous, they can inhabit welfare states where men have no social purpose without succumbing to the vices that we all know occur regularly in welfare states inhabited by people of every skin color. That somehow the rules that govern human nature will be suspended if we have the right sort of intentions when we create government policies. That we can give people drugs for free, but if we call, says, well, if we use the right kind of euphemism to describe why they're getting the drugs, it's okay, bad things aren't going to happen. Those neighborhoods aren't going to crap. That we can set up tent cities and in our public parks, but if we have good progressive hearts and we're progressive in our viewpoints when we set up those tent cities, that crime won't flourish there and they won't become violent in places where there's rampant drug use and they won't destroy the neighborhoods. And for me, a conservative approach to policy has to start with an empirical understanding of human nature, which, by the way, includes the concept of checks and balances. The whole purpose of checks and balances and restraint on the political activities of people, to me, you can call it classical liberalism. It's an empirical understanding of human nature, which to me is why what Donald Trump is doing in the United States is not conservative. It's completely flouting what we know about what happens to societies where one person and his cronies run roughshod over civil liberties and command all the levers of state, including through their flunkies in the legislature. That's not conservative. So to me, there's a powerful conservative critique of what's going on in the United States now, but I don't know how much I'm allowed to say because I know it's a nonpartisan function. But I'll just leave it at that.
I just want to, before you pass that off, I want to ask one quick follow-up about what you were what you were just saying. So you mentioned how conservatism should include an awareness of human nature and should look towards policies that are capable of guarding against those flawed aspects of human nature. Is there another side of the coin in that are there good aspects of human nature that conservative policies should look towards fostering or help flourishing, or is it just a kind of guarding against? Does one imply the other? That's what I'm wondering.
Well, you know, there's a rich literature on incentives and what kind of policy, you know, Malcolm Gladwell has sold how many millions of books by talking about what kind of incentives create this. One problem here is that one of the most powerful incentives for people to do good in society doesn't come from government. It comes from local civic organizations, because people are much more incentivized to help their neighbors than to help people they don't know. So I work at a food bank because there's hunger in my neighborhood. But if you ask me to do that work on behalf of people who weren't in my neighborhood, I might be less inclined. And that to me is not something like, there's no replacement for civic organizations. It's one of the reasons why civic bonds broke down during COVID, because people were more interested in arguing with somebody on the other side of the planet than helping feed somebody who's their neighbor. And then the other thing is religion. You know, data consistently shows that people who are religiously devout are, I mean, you can read this from the tax data, they're much more generous. They give more to charity. They give more of their time to others. The food bank where I work is full of religious people. So the sort of people who are sneered at by secularists or you know, the kind of person that Tristin once was. But then he saw the light.
On the streetcar.
Then he was reborn, my brother. And you know, so I don't, yes, government, I mean, look, the very fact that people get a tax break for giving to charity is a form of incentive, right? So there's that kind of a very sort of bloodless, cut and dried economic incentive. But I would say, and I think maybe Stockwell, they would agree with me, that one thing government can just do, in many cases, is get out of the way and create space for civic organizations, and dare I say religions, to accomplish some of those functions. Because when government tries to directly tell people preach to people about morality, like one of the reasons Justin Trudeau became so unpopular is because he confused his role as Prime Minister with his role as public scold in terms of what sort of things people should believe about social issues, and spent a lot of time preaching about that stuff. And a lot of people are like, we didn't elect you to tell us about, you know, pronouns and, you know, the kind of anti-racist terms we should use. Like it's not befitting of a political leader to do that. You're not the enforcer of private morality. For the government to do what you're talking about, I think it's maybe more about making space for civic organizations and religious leaders to do that.
And I wonder also, perhaps we can return it to the two of you and maybe have your thoughts on that, because both of you mentioned a concern about sort of like large-scale government social programs and wanting to be kind of cautious of that, how these things change and develop. So following up on what Mr. Kaya said, I wonder if either of you have thoughts on that aspect as well. Should morality, for the most part, stay out of what the government is doing, out of government policies as much as possible? Are there moral incentives that are part of government policies? Is it about making space for civic institutions? How can we kind of understand this?
Well, first, when you initiate the question, like we said about a guide, what is the guiding light?
Yeah.
And understanding not just what your own guiding light is, but the guiding light of others, and respecting and then saying, you know, can we work together in spite of that? So in Judaic, not just tradition, but Judaic writing, Hebraic writing, I've got Moses, and we understand the leaving of Egypt under a pretty heavy-duty ruler, and actually the very beginnings of a democratic impulse. Once the so-called children of Israel settled down a little bit, was choose among yourselves. Moses said this to them. Choose among yourselves leaders of 10, leaders of 100, leaders of 1,000, leaders of 10,000, and judge accordingly. And by the way, if you run into significant judgment problems, we've got the Levites, so you can bring it to that court. And if all else fails, Moses being a home guy, you can come to me. So that was actually this notion of choosing among yourselves, and that was picked up in the early church, the very early church, when things were moving along very rapidly and Christianity spreading through the known world at that time. But yet groups of people with different ideas, and there had to be some basic things like feeding the poor and that kind of stuff. And again, the leaders of the church said, choose among yourselves. You folks at Ephesus, choose among yourselves. And that the magic number then was 7, and not that there was any magic. But people, and they articulated certain principles that you should recognize in a person. Are they kind? Are they wise? Are they not given to fisticuffs? You know, these type of things. And so that's where this notion came on. And then where we begin to run into trouble is, and it's already been touched on here, if you, within that context, recognize that Judaic and then Christian thought is based on, first of all, an acceptance among a certain percentage of people that there is in fact a God that can be known. But do you kill somebody else because they say, I don't know about that, but I do agree I shouldn't steal from my neighbor. Now you've got some common ground that you can work on in spite of the fact you have very different core beliefs. And modern thought, I don't know if that's a great term, but and political thought is that if you have, and this is in my first remarks, if you have an errant thought, if you have a thought that does not flow in the mainstream, you need to be taken out. And this is the prevailing view. And even to the place of if somebody wants to articulate a religious position, the thought should be largely, not exclusively at university, public school, etc. No, you cannot take a religious position on anything. We will take you out. We will shut you down. And that leaves, obviously, to huge problems. This sense, and it seems to be the more liberal, small l, philosophical you are, the less tolerance you actually have for, we're talking about diversity, for a diverse view. Here, let me give you a real life case. I was asked a few years ago, I was very honored to be asked to join, I don't know where the number 50 came from, but 50 people were asked from around the world by the Dalai Lama and his group to meet with him in northern India, where he has a government in exile, and help him, bring him advice on dealing with the China-Tibet issue. And so we did that. It was a fantastic time. We were there with him and his followers. We were there for a very mixed, diverse group. And I said, we were on the stage, just something like this. I couldn't believe it, sitting right beside the Dalai Lama. And he's probably thinking, what am I doing sitting beside this guy? But anyway, I said, this is an amazing group because we've been here for 3 days. We are very diverse on many areas. I said, as a matter of fact, I believe that Jesus Christ is actually Lord of the universe. And the Dalai Lama doesn't. Those are pretty significant differences. And yet, we have this respect for each other that we can say, you believe this, and you believe this. He even gave me a book one time about the differences between Buddha and Jesus. And largely I didn't agree with the items in the book, but we had this respect for each other. And we said, let's work together on this problem with China. And this is where we need to be really, I think, tough and rough on whether it's from media or if it's in the academic world, not allowing the expression of a different point of view. I mean, we take some extremist positions on it, but accepting the fact that people can work together, even on a guiding light factor, something as critical, I'll say. I speak in a lot of synagogues, sometimes more synagogues than churches, and I was speaking at one in Eastern Canada. Rabbis were there and they met with me before I was speaking to the congregation, and the chief rabbi said, Mr. Day, we've got some theological differences. And I said, I recognize that, and I was asked to speak here anyway. He said, we do not even agree on who the Messiah is. I said, I recognize that, Rabbi. He said, but I look at it this way. He said, when the Messiah returns, he will tell us who's right and who's wrong. And I went, I'm good with that. I can roll with that. So there's this ability to work together, but I believe these are conservative small c principles that you can accept. You have differences with somebody and still work together, and those are age-old. Those are Judaic, those are Christian, The prophet Isaiah said, come on now, let's reason together. He actually said that. Come now, let's reason together. Apostle Paul goes into a huge arena, all different philosophical point of views, and he says, let's talk about this. And that is such an important thing that wherever we're coming from, we have to, this is where we get into the language they say of right-wing people, we have to defend the right of people to articulate even their most core beliefs, and in spite of that, we can still work together.
I think your question here, I'm going to take a slightly different read of this. I think your question here puts your finger on a challenge that we have for conservatives to think through this exact question. Because human nature being what it is, of course we're capable of virtues. We can figure out what they are, we can learn them from the past, we can deduce some of them by reason. The flip side of that, though, for human nature is that conservatives are also tolerant. We understand that sometimes our reason is wrong, that sometimes our appeal to the past and practices of the past is misleading us, that we have to be understanding that there's people with many different lives they want to live in different sorts of ways. So while somebody has to inculcate virtues and patterns of behavior and thought that improve us as individuals and maybe improve our communities over time, we also have to find space for tolerance. And I think conservatives struggle to get the balance of this right. When Mr. Trudeau's government, I don't want to get a political comment here, I'm going to use a political example to try to come back to this. When Mr. Trudeau was elected, I thought the big problem with this government would be the legalization of marijuana. Because I thought that would take us in a path of social destruction. I think we've come short of that. I was wrong about that. I think the challenge that he poses for us is medical assistance in death. Because in a sense, you know, the conservative instinct to want to decentralize and to trust people with their private lives, that there's many different types of lives to live, that people are in a better position on their own to make judgments about their own personal situations. You know, that leads you to think, okay, well, maybe that's not such a bad idea. But on the other hand, I think the devaluation of virtues around life and endurance and so forth also has not just a personal impact on the people involved, but a social impact as well. I think this has not been an issue in the election campaign because both parties, two main parties, are cross-pressured on this. The Conservatives have had some difficulty trying to put their finger, or trying to get their solid footing on an issue around medical assistance in death, even though I'm horrified by what's happened since the law changed, and I fear future changes in a terrible direction in the future. Your question about can the government take notice of better patterns of life and use its authority to try to encourage and reinforce what comes from obviously elsewhere in society as well. That's a difficult one for us.
Thank you all. Building on that, something that kind of has come out in all of what you're saying, in particular what you both just said, is this idea that conservatism, or a fundamental aspect to it, is this openness to other ideas and other ways of life, and wanting to have a conversation about, well, what is actually best here? What is the thing that we can agree upon that we ought to move towards? And how can we have a conversation about that, recognizing that people are coming from distinct perspectives? Now, if someone were to kind of parody a critique of conservatives, they might say that's not true. Conservatives are incredibly intolerant, very unwelcoming towards change. They don't want to engage in different, with people of different views or different standpoints or something. So if an essential part is having these conversations and having a kind of civil discourse surrounding fundamental issues, and you want to cultivate that in the sort of civic arena rather than just kind of top-down level, how do you go about doing that? And how do you respond to claims that conservatism is actually the opposite of being open and tolerant? And kind of, I guess, to go alongside that, how do you do that when some of these conversations have the kind of high stakes that they do? For instance, with me, the stakes of that conversation are incredibly high. So how do you have an open conversation when the stakes over certain things like that are that high?
So, excellent question. The ironclad rule of politics is that the side that wants to have conversations is the side losing the culture war. If you're winning the culture war, you don't want to have conversations. You want to end conversations. And social media has had a disastrous effect on political discourse because most of the discourse you see on social media isn't really a discourse about values. It's a discourse about what values you're even allowed to talk about. And the people who have the majority of the power in any kind of silo, look, making arguments is exhausting. What Tristin and I do for a living, trust me, most of you could handle it. It's much easier to say, I'm not going to talk about that. That's an illegitimate subject. My human rights as a conservative are not up for debate. And you close down debate, you're essentially weaponizing your majority within a particular silo and to satirize, demean, smear, libel the other side as being in bad faith. You accuse them of making superficially rational arguments which are actually a mask for racist or bigoted or tyrannical or fascistic arguments. I mean, we've seen this all the time where you're having a discussion with somebody and saying, oh, just come out and say it, you're a fascist. Like, well, actually, I was just talking about streetcars. And, but the idea is that the faster you can get to you're a fascist or you're a communist or whatnot, the faster you can say, you know, I can end this debate because I've demonstrated that you're acting in bad faith and I don't have to expend the energy of defending my views. And unfortunately, different silos have different supermajorities. So if you're on Blue Sky, which is apparently a thing, apparently, like, you know, as soon as you make certain kind of arguments that progressives dislike, you can get thrown out because they think that's an illegitimate argument. I'm not even going to bother attacking it. I'm just going to, like, label you a bigot and get you banned or whatever. By the same token, you know, if you're at a conservative convention and you say something that's off message from Trump, you know, you might get thrown out or banned or shunned or a primary challenge if you happen to be a congressman or something because you've said something that you're not allowed to say. And they're not going to debate you. They're going to smear you. And social media is an incredible way, if you want to have this lazy meta argument about what you're not allowed to say and not allowed to say, social media is fantastic. You're going to spend all your time on social media. If you want to actually have a good faith discussion about where the good life is, it's terrible. What you were saying about, you know, this argument about, well, what conservatives really want is to shut down discussion is actually absolutely true of conservatives in a context where they feel completely confident that they control the particular political environment and they can take the football and go home and say, it's all settled. We're not having this discussion anymore. Progressives do exactly the same thing. This is unfortunately a universal tendency. As soon as one side feels they're winning the culture war on any given issue in any given silo, the first thing to do is try and shut the debate down by libeling the other side as acting in bad faith or being agents of hatred.
I didn't claim conservatives were open-minded and super tolerant, but I think, you know, potentially that's what turned people away from, you know, the conservative movement in the past. The idea that, oh, you know, they're not going to include me because I'm gay or because I'm a woman or because I'm a certain ethnic group. But I think right now, the strength that is leading people to conservatism, and, you know, the polls are there. Even recent polls are showing that we have young people moving towards the big C conservative party in a way that's never really been seen anywhere in the Western world, to the point where we have young people that are more likely to vote conservatives than old people. We've had waves of people voting conservative, you know, Mulroney, 1958 with Diefenbaker, where you've had a plurality, and the fact that the young people are more conservative than the older, and I think it's because they're not necessarily attracted towards intolerance, but they're attracted towards hard rules that is offered by conservatism. A good example would be on the issue of criminal justice. This idea that is very mainstream now by polls, 80+% of people saying there are people in society who cannot be rehabilitated. They love raping, they love murdering, they just have to be put away because if you let them out, they're going to hurt people. And this is, according to a very institutionally captured justice system, there is no space for these people. There is always a second chance. There is always a chance for rehabilitation, and that's why we are, frequently giving bail and early release to people like that. So I think what is most attractive about conservatism is that it has these hard rules. Murder is bad. This is a man, this is a woman, and it isn't as open-minded as perhaps progressivism is, and there's a time for that, and there's a time not for that. And I think conservative institutions, conservative parties have to be making the case right now that, this is a time before drugs are bad. Maybe that wasn't the case, circa 1988, just at the height of the drug war. But these sort of simplistic, dare I say, intolerant rules have some relevance after we've seen, complete open-minded relativism. There is no yes or no answers to anything.
One follow-up on that. How do you persuade someone that, especially if you're seeing circumstances change frequently, how do you persuade someone that something is bad of a hard rule?
I would recommend you elect a super progressive. Okay, so you were mentioning morality earlier, and this idea that I think if there's a conservative approach to morality and to human decency, I think it's the idea, it's an acceptance that bad actors can come in and screw things up. So if you look at everything that's gone wrong in Canada over the last 10 years, I don't know if I'm answering your question right, but I've been trying to think of a unified theory of everything that's gone wrong, from MAID to drug policy to everything, and I think it all goes back to, it was passed by people who did not consider that bad actors were going to come in and screw everything up. So when you look at the early debates about medical assistance in dying, or even the Supreme Court case, you had Supreme Court justices saying, I forget what the direct line is, but there was people testifying. If you have the lowest barrier MAID system in the entire world, it's going to immediately be abused. And Supreme Court justices said, this is Canada, that's not going to happen. It's not like we're going to have some MAID doctor who goes on BBC and next to the couch where she kills people and is laughing about how funny it all is. That's a direct reference. I'm not going to mention names or libel, defamation, etc. But and that's true with drug policy. That is true with criminal justice policy. It is at the core of all of these an unbelievable naivety that there aren't people who are going. You can put in gender self-ID, and there isn't someone out there that is going to potentially abuse a system where you can just instantly identify as another gender. So I've seen this. Canada has done this harder than almost any other country on earth. So I forget what your original question was, but I think there's a role for conservatives saying, you know what bad is, you know what good is. There's a whole pile of escalating issues in which 80% of people are on one side, the institutions on the other side. I mean, we've seen the polls, a lot of them have been commissioned by the National Post. When you ask people, when people immigrate to Canada, should they, agree and share Canadian values? It's like 80%. Among recent immigrants, it's even higher. They hate the other newer immigrants. They hate people who aren't integrating. Same on bail policies. So, yeah, I think people are moving towards an idea of what is wrong and what is right. And right now, I think there are some issues in which only conservative parties and conservative institutions can capitalize it, because it's just not being touched by the other side.
The great question again, and how do you convince somebody, if that's their job, I don't know. But politically, if you're trying to, let's say, promote a certain piece of legislation or advance a certain item, you better be able to show with a degree of credence that following this path on that legislation is actually, in a utilitarian way, good for you as the individual and good for society. If you can't show that, you're going to be in deep trouble. And conversely, if you can demonstrate in a utilitarian way the positives or the negatives, that's how you do it. It's easy to say. Going back again to the Judaic model, the initial model, I guess you could argue, was, well, God said it, so we're really best if we just accept that. Well, we're human beings, so we like to push that. So that says there's an element to human nature. So if I want to talk to someone about, it's interesting, it's the media keep raising the transgender stuff. We're just being nice, polite people here, but so let's talk about that. I should be able to say that somebody, a biological man who has subjected himself to either chemical or surgical alteration should still not be allowed to go into a girl's, I'm sorry, people get mad when we say this, but into a girl's shower room. I think empirically, I can say that should not happen. And that person that still has the right to go to doctors and chemists and alter themselves as an adult, but there are certain things that I should be able to demonstrate. That is indeed not a good thing. I think I'm using that as an example. It's demonstrable. And we should be able to use. But what will happen, and this is part of our human nature, maybe not the divine side of it, when it gets right down to it, sometimes we just don't want to accept that. And even if you have the empirical evidence, you're still going to say, I don't care. I don't believe it. So you're always going to run into that, but you should be able to demonstrate how this would not result in a positive outcome, and that's why we're going to say no to it.
I'm not sure I have a very good answer to this question. I didn't have a very good answer to the last question either, so you're pushing me to the limits of my willingness to put my foot down here. I think there are, obviously I teach at university like you do, so I think there are people who can learn by reason, by applying themselves to the great sources and the great debates, by thinking through the problem for themselves. They can come up with an answer that's pretty good and go out there and run with it. For the rest of us, and I'll put myself in the other category, we have to learn by hitting our head against the wall, by tripping over things, by making mistakes. We learn by bad experience. We learn from doing things that turn out to be horribly badly wrong, and we are honest enough with ourselves and we'll never do that again. And so I think, to answer Tristan's answer to your question, I'll put a spin on that. One of the things I like about coming to British Columbia, not this part of British Columbia, further west, big experiments in let's legalize heroin. The guy who did that, I see, is now a star candidate for one of the parties running here. I don't quite understand that. The mayor, the guy who let everything go. Okay, I'm sure he thought that was a good idea. I'm not accusing him of bad faith. I think he legitimately thought it was a good idea, as Tristin said, the height of the war on drugs. We don't need to criminalize all of this. Okay. And then we'll go a little bit further than that. We'll encourage people to have kind of self-service at the dispensing machine at the hospital and so forth. And I think we learned through terrible human carnage, suffering on an almost unimaginable scale, in a first world country where we pride ourselves on being well covered, that's a terrible idea, and we should take a step back from that. Is that a priori intolerance about where we should draw the line on drug policy? I don't think so. Where should we draw the line on drug policy? Look, I think there's lots of room for debate on that. But I think we proved ourselves, British Columbia's signature contribution to public policy, is to let that happen in Vancouver and some places in Victoria and so forth, so the rest of us could learn we're never doing that in our place. And maybe in Vancouver, Victoria, people figured it out by virtue of hitting their heads against the wall many times over. We shouldn't do that ourselves.
Right.
We're going to move on to Q&A. I want to add, for the lovely people who have come out today so that all of you can participate in the conversation as well, we have some time for Q&A now. And we're going to set up a microphone. Amar is setting up a microphone for us right now, so you can come on up to it. You can form a queue behind it. And in the interest, I suppose, of civil discourse, make your questions brief and questions. Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
On the left or the right?
It's
on the left.
Yeah.
On your left.
know if I'm first in line.
Yeah. I think he should just hand you the mic.
Okay, so thank you. First of all, I'm really impressed with the students that having put this together. I'm actually surprised at the university that we have this. And I want to comment on something that, and ask a question. I think it was Stockwell, who started with, well, I'm from the psychology department, Paul Gambios. So who started with, okay, communism, we first have to get rid of God, then we gotta, get rid of the family, then we have to get rid of property. That's what they wanted to do. But isn't our body property? And why do you think was the society so accepting of governments taking positions on how we should be dealing with our body during COVID-19? Why did this happen? I'll ask anyone who wants to answer that. But it's a very important question and a very disturbing one. So,
Well, it's a really important question for sure. And to me, the problem that led to the problems was dissenting medical scientific thought was not permitted. And it should have been. So wherever we are on the issue, and I'm talking about, we're not talking about one or two, I'll use the word professor, but I don't want to be perturbed, one or two wacky professors or scientists saying, well, I've got a theory. But when you shut down what should be a reasonable discussion, you are going to force people to be reactionary. And that certainly happened in Canada, happened around the world. So I don't know if that helps with your great question, but especially in positions of government authority, you have to be able to have people come to the table with evidence scientifically based, which needs to be considered. It's not going to convince everybody, but by barring that from happening, and it happened in a significant way in British Columbia, the shutting down of discussion, I just go on and on in terms of doctors who lost their jobs, nurses who lost their jobs, scientists, scientific think tanks that were shut down. The more strident you're going to be, again, other than extreme issues, the more problem you're going to have. So I think that created a problem. That type of discussion was not allowed.
Let me take a different, I agree with what Stock said, but let me take a different read of it. I think in COVID we turned out to be lucky in the sense that the vaccines that were developed, which we were promised or people thought at some point would provide some protection against transmitting from one person to another, turned out to be not quite so effective as everybody had thought on that front. And so the case for mandatory vaccination kind of falls apart at that point. You can take the vaccine if you need it to protect yourself, but if I take it, it's not going to protect stock, it's not going to protect other people in the room as much as we thought. The actual reduction of community transmission is not that impressive. If it had turned out that those vaccines were an absolute stop on transmission to transmission from person to person of a virus that for some chunk of the population was going to be quite deadly, I think the debate retrospectively would have turned out differently. I'm not suggesting good or bad. I have views on that, but we would get into that. We could do available competition. But I think we were lucky that the vaccines turned out to be not quite so good at preventing transmission from person to person, and therefore we avoided the question the questioner put to us.
Hey there. Yeah, I was thankful that Chesterton Spence was brought up pretty early in the conversation, right? The only gentleman with full head of hair. Conservatism and Chesterton Spence go hand in hand from my perspective, because you have to see what's on the other side of the fence before you take it down, and generally there's a slippery slope. You start with a joint, you end with heroin. You start with elderly care and MAID, you end up with, I sprained my ankle, give me the shot. When does conservatism reflect on itself, in Canada specifically, and stop being progressive for the sake of saying we are progressive conservatives,
and be conservatives for the sake of being conservatives. I know Stockwell was around back when the Reform and the Conservative Party joined forces, and for some reason, the name of the party was the Progressive Conservatives, not the We Are Conservatives. And I believe that calling conservatism progressive is antithetical to what conservatism is on its premise. And when, as conservatives, do we reflect on that and say, hey, look, maybe we have to respect Chesterton's fence and not be progressive just for the sake of it because it looks good in a newspaper?
I could say, when I look at, so I live in Victoria, and when people approach me, and so this is the most left-wing city in the entire country. This is Canada's Portland, Victoria. So whenever someone has some dark right-wing thought in the middle of the night, they call me their national close friend. And whenever that happens, it's always some sort of like culture war issue. It's always actually issues that conservative parties never want to touch with a 10-foot pole. So it's always like, where are the tampons in the bathroom? Why did I see a woman in a kneecap? All these things that a conservative party politician would get very awkward about talking about. But what you're mentioning there is just a party and an institution being much more open about what conservatism is, using the word and actually defending that. I think that's what people are craving, that particular thing right now. And if I could use a really crude example, when you're hiring a dominatrix, you don't want someone to put on poofy sleeves and take you out for high tea. You want them to tie you down and call you a bitch. And I think if this election does result in Canada electing a conservative government, they do not want Doug Ford. If you are going out of your way to go to the polling station, mark conservative on the ballot and ghosts fly out of it, and this is the first time you've ever done that, you're not doing that just because you want good management. It's because there's a whole bunch of stuff you want rolled back. You don't want just, they're going to stop making bad policy. There's some bad policy you want them to dial back. And I think if they don't do that, they're going to lose. So if you're just Doug Ford, you just kind of run things semi-competently, and every once in a while you tell the homeless to get a job. I don't think that's gonna work long term. So I think what you're mentioning, I think the craving for that is bigger than it's ever been. And I don't think it's ever been, in like 40 years, it hasn't been that way. I think you couldn't have a during the Harper era, you couldn't have Stephen Harper taking on the courts. Like, judicial activism is out of control, we're going to take on the courts. He would have been lambasted for it. I think the appetite for it is much bigger now. I think that answers your question.
Thank you. Very Christian response, I appreciate that.
Hi there. So far we've heard about issues like cancel culture, criminal justice reform, and drug policy in Maine. I just wanted the panel to clarify, what do you think the main issues that conservatives should prioritize, and what steps can they take to get this done?
I did have notes on what to work. Well, there's a difference between what you can campaign on and what you can get elected on, and what I see as, they did ask me before this panel to put notes on what I see as the biggest issue that requires reform. I would say institutional capture. Mostly because I would say, so everywhere from the court system to universities to even the Canadian Armed Forces, you have had just incredible amounts of institutional capture to the point where no one ever believes me when I tell them, how extreme it is. So to the point where when you're applying for a research grant, you have to get into intricate detail about the race and nationality of everybody on your research team. And they're going to use those immutable characteristics to decide whether you can get grant money. People don't really believe that's happening. Or they think this is Canada, you can't do that, that's illegal. Or I'll point out, there was a Department of Defense, a big report that came out, their anti-racism report. And this was signed off by the defense team. This wasn't just some side agency, which contained the line, racism is the system in Canada. This is just full-blown anti-racism, oppressor versus oppressed dynamic, which is weird for a military because you're asking people to go out and get shot somewhere. For the government of Canada, and you're saying, oh, but we've just finished telling you this is a horrible racist genocide state, and every institution you're defending with your life is inherently racist, and there's no way around it, and we have to do. So I don't know. That's what I would focus on when I think of what needs to be fixed, and then everything else falls from that. It is sort of looking at the extent of judicial activism. So often in the argument, people don't realize how many of our sort of many of the issues you mentioned originate with an activist Supreme Court decision from 8 or 9 or 10 years ago. So MAID, bail, all of these started with a really blunt Supreme Court decision written in crayon. So the argument is you can threaten to repeal as many of these as you want. You can have Pierre Poilievre say we're going to put life sentences in. But if you're still going to have an unbelievably powerful institutional culture, which is just going to throw a wrench at all those, you're not going to get any of it done. So the hardest thing to do, it would have to be a very drawn-out, strategic fight against that kind of entrenched power.
Yeah, great question on what as.
Thank you to the panel. In the 1930s, you would have expected to see protectionism be more small C conservative. In the 1980s, big C conservatism was very, pro-free trade. What do you think on trade and economic issues are the underlying principles of small C conservatism? And where do you see that going in a big C conservative perspective now? Thank you.
So that's a great question because conservatives have no coherent ideological position on trade. If you're in Europe, it is a conservative position to say, in France, for instance, or Japan, say, we are traditionally a country that grows our own food. Being a farmer is, it's part of who we are, and if in Japan, there's still enormous tariffs on rice because part of being a Japanese person is to manufacture and consume homegrown rice. That's part of their identity. Food in every culture is integral to who you are. So to be a conservative, to some extent, is to be a protectionist. I mean, listen to the nonsense people use to justify the dairy cartel in Canada. Can you imagine eating cheese from around the world? How disgusting. So there is a primordial conservative protectionist response, and you see in the United States on steel, because a lot of conservatives live in a World War II propaganda posters where people are always producing steel, and they imagine that that's kind of what the United States still is. So if you put enough tariffs on steel, we'll all look like people did in 1942. And that's part of conservative mythology. On the other hand, conservatives are also about capitalism. And protectionism puts enormous fetters on international capitalism. And this is why I hate it when conservatives start banging on about the globalists. We're all globalists. We all consume technology from around the world. And one of the things that's injured the conservative cause is these conspiracy theories about the WAF and Davos and Bilderbergers and stuff like that. We live in a globalized economy. And if you like capitalism and you like the fruits of capitalism, then you like free trade. And one of the positive developments in Canada is, 20 years ago, free trade was sort of a partisan issue. Liberals, progressives were always we can't allow split-run magazines, and we have to preserve our culture. And they were always talking about all these protections we needed because the American cultural imperialists were going to take over our economy. And then 20 years later, it's the opposite. Everyone's a free trader. NDP's free trade. Everyone's about free trade. And this is because, depending on context, there is no coherent ideological valence to trade. It's one of the reasons why I think, the previous question asked in good faith, well, what should conservatives talk about? The problem with the current media cycle is conservatives are talking about whatever people are obsessed with. Right now, people are rightly obsessed with Donald Trump and his insane plan to destroy the North American economy with tariffs. And how many percentage points did international stock markets drop today? And so it doesn't matter if conservatives, no, I want to talk about MAID and I want to talk about dropping the Ottawa workforce by 70%. No one cares about that. The attention spans have lowered and people want to talk about what it is that's in the news now, what's causing them anxiety. Anxiety levels have spiked, primarily among young people, but also among older people, and often these media interviews, they cite current events, because they're on their phones all the time. And they want politicians to offer solutions, often palliative solutions, but solutions nonetheless, to whatever it is that's causing them anxiety. And so they have no bandwidth for thinking about Edmund Burke, which is too bad because he's really interesting. But it's one of the reasons that politicians of every stripe, including conservatives, they're in a straitjacket. They have to talk about the issues that concern people, and right now it's trade. And there is no, I hate to disappoint, there's no coherent conservative ideology on the trade issue.
I think we have time for, thank you. I think we have time for one final question.
Oh, I get the last question. This is amazing. What a great event and turnout. I remember when I was at University of Calgary, we used to have events like this all the time. I saw Marvin Alefsky and lots of discussions. Anyway, I will get to a question. So, Tristin, you noted when you were talking about youth and why they're attracted to conservatives because they like these hard and fast rules. I think I'm a little bit more hopeful in that regard, and I see some trend lines that I think are really good for the future of conservatism. So, you know, this like rise in like homesteading. You see a rise in religiosity again amongst young people. I think that's more American, but it is really prevalent here as well, and things like not drinking, no alcohol, like that's huge among young population. Like when I was in high school and university, you were drinking every weekend, and this generation is really different. And I find that there's maybe a little bit of hope of that. It's almost like they're turning off what the progressives are blaring on all their social media, and they're just going back to roots. And so I'm going to tie it into today's election, or the election that's happening. If there is a failure at the ballot for Pierre, and he's been talking a lot about these affordability issues, and he has this kind of youth coming in that we haven't seen before, what is the future for the conservative movement in Canada?
A nice, simple question.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've seen those exact same trends, and when I try and put my finger on why it's happening, I think I also live next to a high school, and you're right. These kids, I thought there was going to be graffiti. I thought there was going to be beer cans. The only cans I found in my backyard were probably put there by me in 2002. So they're just on their phones. They're quiet. They're not even disruptive. I'll go to the beach and they're turning down. They're like, even the music isn't particularly sharp. Anyway, I think as to why that's happened, young Canadians, anybody under the age of 35, has basically spent most of their adult life in a badly written Ezra Levant novel. They've just seen a lot of things not working to an extent that, I mean, this is the generational divide we're seeing in this current election. It's between, old people, not all old people, but sort of in love with this idea of Canada that they remember, Mike Myers. And then there's younger people who are saying this is fundamentally broken. I have never known a Canada in which I had easy primary care. I have never known a Canada in which it was ever feasible that I was able to own a home. I have never known a Canada in which this particular park didn't have a tent city in it. So I think, and it goes beyond affordability, because just look at our BC election, in which the BC Conservative Party, their affordability plan was just a picture of a house. Like there was no housing plan, and they still did really well among young people. I mean, there was nothing. So you could say this is just economic. They just are completely getting ground by the economy, and that's absolutely true. But I think it goes beyond that. I think there's a cultural understanding. Be it going to church, be it not wanting to be stabbed on public transit anymore. Potentially coming around to the idea that, maybe drugs aren't so good. And just the fact of, I've got a 7-year-old in school, you are getting, if you're growing up in this environment, and I went to school in BC in the 1990s, but, the sort of, the way they're taught about, the gay rights movement is super lame now. I mean, being gay was so cool in the 90s. The gay marriage was illegal. There was people who said you were going to drown in a lake of fire. It was really edgy. And now it's your teacher is sort of hammering this in. Now it's International Trans Day of Visibility, and yesterday it was International Gay Day of Visibility, and it's institutionalized. So I have no idea how they took the gay rights movement and made it lame and crappy, but they have. And so there's any number of those things in which, you are going to have a natural reaction against that. So I see graffiti around Victoria where it's literally like, only two genders, God save the king. And it's because that is the most, if you want to rebel against the institution, that's what you're going to end up doing. So I don't know how widespread that's going to be.
Okay, this is we've all seen the graffiti and we recognize your handwriting, Tristin. So I'm just going to answer the question. So in terms of people wanting order, so I see this. So I have teenage daughters, they're in university, and I offered my eldest daughter's boyfriend a beer, and he said, no, it interferes with protein synthesis. He goes to the gym like 4 times a day. And the thing is, what makes them conservative is they're all on their phones. So if they go to a party and someone does something outrageous, they're all terrified that it's going to be a video and put on social media. The presence of having a phone in everyone's pocket has an inherently conservative effect on people in the sense that they're worried that everything they do, they're going to be held accountable. I said and did all kinds of outrageous things when I was a teenager. Thank God they weren't recorded. But there is a very, not in the political sense, but in the social conservative influence of a phone in everyone's pocket, because it holds people accountable. They call it cancel culture, call it anything, but it actually modulates people's behavior, not always in a healthy way, but it constantly makes them anxious about doing something outrageous or offensive. I will say in terms of, we all agree that when religion disappears, it leaves a religion-shaped hole in people's brains. They want an ersatz religion. I'm not a religious person myself, but there's a reason that Jordan Peterson's bestseller was called 12 Rules. What, the 12 Rules of Living? Or yeah, but the idea is young people especially, there's a great documentary film about them, and you can actually see people coming up on the street and treat them like a prophet. It's actually quite creepy, but it shows how desperate people are to have someone in their life saying, like, don't be a bum, make your bed, do this, do that. He can almost say anything, like vacuum your living room twice a day. Oh, okay. But like the idea is it's a rule, and there's 12 of them, and people have a natural understanding that society works better and they are happier if there are some norms they have to observe. It's not just a religious thing, it's part of our evolutionary psychology.
You've all just said so many things I want to ask follow-up questions to, but because we too are subject to norms, we'll have to end our conversation right now and hand it back over to our wonderful student host. So thank all of you for your comments.
Thank you to all of you for taking the time out today to attend. Thank you to the panelists for what was an informative and thought-provoking session. I never knew the topic of street class would be so divisive. Yeah. Thank you for all those who raised questions. Thank you again to our sponsors, the Manning Foundation, Macdonald Laurier Institute, and the Heterodox Academy campus community. And finally, thank you to the amazing team at the PPE Student Association who put this on. Discussions such as these are important. As we live in a world of polarization, we must seek to find the truth. For without the truth, knowledge is useless. The PPE Student Association seeks to do exactly that, to seek the truth, to help cultivate a society which is well-informed and thinks critically. We host a variety of events, from panels such as this, workshops, talks, and many social events. For a strong community, it's just as pivotal as a knowledgeable community. We constantly seek to be bigger and better as a student association, and today it's a momentous occasion for us to be able to host our first ever public event. We hope that you enjoyed today's discussion and that you seek to engage with us further. Maybe as an audience, maybe as a participant. And maybe if you're a student, you want to get involved in our student association. If you do want to support us and be it financially or in whatever shape or form, our information will be up on the screen, and contact us, or you can always come to speak to one of our members of our team. Once again, thank you for attending today, and we hope that you have a great rest of your evening.